Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of a technical issue. But thank you for joining us for this ADAPT conversation, where we'll be taking a look at the role that parks and green space can play in the fight against climate change. I'm Brendan Rivers. I'm the lead reporter for ADAPT from WJCT Public Media. ADAPT is our project focused on how climate change is impacting Northeast Florida and what's being done about it. Please sign up for our monthly ADAPT newsletter after this evening's event. That way you'll be the first to read in-depth original reporting on climate change, and you'll be able to find out about more events like this one. To sign up, go to adaptflorida.org. I did want to go over some general housekeeping before we get things started tonight. Audience members will be muted throughout the entire event, but if you have questions for our panelists, you can type them out at any time in the chat window that you should see on the right of your screen, and make sure you mark them as a question. To do that, put your question in the chat window and then click on the bubble next to it. That bubble should turn red and the letter Q should pop up inside of it, letting us know that it's a question. We will try to get to as many questions as we can before we wrap things up tonight. You can always interact with each other in the chat window as well, but we will only be taking questions that are marked as questions. If your question is for a specific panelist, please be sure to include their name in the question. Okay, and now I'd like to welcome our panelists. First, we're joined by Dr. Rebecca Beavers, Coastal Geology and Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service. Dr. Beavers has been the NPS's point of contact for sea level rise and coastal adaptation to climate change since the year 2000. Dr. Beavers is based out of Denver now, but if I recall correctly from our conversation before the event, you said you're pretty familiar with our state and region. Is that right? Okay, I'm not hearing Dr. Beavers right now. I will come back to her in just a second. Let's see if our second guest, Gloria McNair, if her audio is working. Gloria McNair is Groundwork Jacksonville's Community Engagement Coordinator. She works with citizens, many of them from historically underserved urban neighborhoods, to help shape projects like the McCoys Creek restoration and the Emerald Trail, which we'll discuss in greater detail later tonight. Thank you for joining us, Ms. McNair.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, before we move on, Dr. Beavers, are we hearing you now?
Hi, Brendan. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. So yeah, you're pretty familiar with Northeast Florida, is that correct?
I am. I actually grew up in the Carolinas and I worked in Florida twice. So I've lived in the Southeast US for quite a while. And I had the benefit to travel to all of the coastal national parks. I've also had a lot of reasons to come back to Florida, namely Hurricane Matthew. I worked out of Jacksonville for a while helping with the recovery efforts.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And finally, we're joined by Nancy Powell, the Executive Director of Scenic Jacksonville and leader of the Riverfront Parks Now Coalition. Her advocacy with these groups focuses on turning downtown city-owned property into public green space and parks. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Powell.
Thank you for having me.
All right, panelists, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And please feel free to respond to each other's comments and pose your own questions to each other throughout the evening. I want this to be as much of an open dialogue as possible. Okay, Dr. Beavers, let's start with you. Climate change poses a huge threat to our region, especially when it comes to flooding, sea level rise, and extreme heat. How can parks and green space help communities like ours cope with these impacts?
Yes, thank you for these important questions for the National Park Service. Parks and natural landscapes are amazing resources for our coastal communities. They provide the ability to do stormwater accommodation. So when we have storm surge, some of these green spaces can accommodate some of that additional water. They provide a variety of ecosystem services, aquifer recharge, etc. But also our plants, they can trap and store carbon dioxide. So there are a lot of important resources that these green spaces and parks can provide to our populations.
Okay, and you mentioned that the plants and the trees in these parks can trap and store the carbon emissions that are driving climate change. How much is that coming into effect here? Like, is it a significant amount from, say, just the kind of parks and green spaces we have here in Northeast Florida?
Well, I'll say Jacksonville has an amazing program. You actually have a program that's planting trees in your community. And so you're actively encouraging that. So that's one of the landmarks of your area that you are really known for. So while human emissions are certainly our major contributions to climate change, what we can do in terms of our green spaces and parks is offer one way to mitigate some of our emissions.
Okay. Ms. McNair, the Hogan's Creek and McCoys Creek restoration projects that Groundwork Jacksonville has undertaken in partnership with the city are very much focused on flooding issues. Can you tell us about these two creeks, what your organization is trying to do with them, and how the city is involved with the projects?
Well, first, I'd like to say that the city has been a wonderful partner. I cannot acknowledge them enough. They've allowed us to inform the design for McCoys Creek, which is underway currently, and we will continue to partner with them as we move forward with the Emerald Trail. So McCoys and Hogan's Creek are urban creeks that frame downtown Jacksonville. Both are tributaries of the St. Johns River, and both flood the neighborhoods, damaging homes and reducing the ability for people to enjoy their neighborhood. So over the years, the creeks have been overgrown. They've been polluted from industry and runoff. And both of these things have really hindered people's enjoyment of it. Both of these creeks used to be places that people enjoyed. They would fish, they had activities there. And our desire is to mitigate that flooding that is affecting these neighborhoods around McCoys and Hogan's Creeks, and bring back waterways that people can enjoy, that they can go kayaking, they can go fishing once again and feel safe about it. And that the creeks have been bulkheaded and changed from their natural habitat from years ago. So McCoys Creek will be returned to a natural meandering creek that will encourage habitat to return. Birds, wildlife is going to be wonderful, and there should be some groundbreaking observed very soon, maybe as early as next month. And that McCoys Creek and Hogan's Creek will be gems of our Emerald Trail design. And I'd also like to tell you a little bit about other funding that we've received, and it's for the watershed of both McCoys and Hogan's Creeks. And that should be, and I'm going to my notes now, excuse me, to create an ecologically based watershed restoration and management plan for both of the creeks. And this will impact so many people. There are 10 distinct neighborhoods involved within 14 census tracts. And 68% of the residents within this project are African American. Approximately 72% of the households are considered low or very low or extremely low income. So it's the impact that it's going to have will be immeasurable. Hogan's Creek, we are just beginning the process with it, and some of you may see a survey floating around asking about how you feel about Hogan's Creek. Please take the survey and share your opinion, because everything that we do is very informed, and we want to engage the public and let them have a voice in what's happening in their communities.
Okay, and you mentioned the Emerald Trail Project. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that involves?
Yes, would you please show the map of the Emerald Trail so that people kind of understand?
Let's see.
Some folks are like, well, how can I get to the Emerald Trail? Well, it's not really built yet, except for portions of the S line. You see the dotted area, that's where the S line currently is. And we're going to connect the urban core community. I think it's going to be great, an opportunity for people to share in economic development and shared space. It's a 30-year project. The first mile of it, the first 1.3 miles will be the La Villa connector, the La Villa link, and that will be taking place very soon in a few weeks. And it should take about a year to complete that project.
Okay, so
I think it speaks for itself. I like, to show the map.
Yeah, it's definitely impressive. So when are you anticipating that all of these projects are going to be wrapped up?
Oh, like I said, it's a 10-year project, 2029, because we've already been working on it, right? So 2029.
Okay. All right. And Ms. Powell, you and the organizations that you represent have been very outspoken about wanting riverfront parks in Jacksonville, in part to make the city more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Can you walk us through what specifically you're advocating for and how you think it would help Jacksonville deal with climate change?
Well, yes. The Riverfront Parks now, we are a grassroots organization consisting of now 13 nonprofit organizations who have come together with a vision to turn our last remaining city-owned properties along the riverfront into a major destination waterfront park and river linear park system that can do really so many things. It can revitalize downtown, bring our community together, and mitigate the effects of sea level rise, extreme heat, and flooding effects. We've seen this in so many cities across the country, and that's part of what I think people have gotten excited about, is seeing so many things happening, parks being built in the last 5 years, parks in design right now that are exciting. And so we are urging our city leaders not to pass up this opportunity and to make this a reality. But let me give you just a little bit of context. As everyone saw during Hurricane Irma, our downtown is at extreme vulnerability. And if you could show that first photo that we have. So, this is the downtown North Bank along the Brooklyn where all of our office buildings are. And it was during Hurricane Irma. Now, remember, Irma was not even a Category 1 storm. So it flooded all of downtown and, disrupted businesses. Recently we've had the resiliency committees and the action adaptation area working groups. And if you show the next slide, you can see that the coastal high hazard area. So this is, more a little bit farther east of what you just saw. It's the shipyards, the North Bank and the South Bank. The bottom part is the San Marco area. But this just shows that, and many maps show different types of things, but these areas are at high risk of flooding over the next, 100 years, 60 years, 100 years. And, the models show that it's probably going to get worse, not better. So if you go to the next slide. So on the left-hand side is the shipyards property. This is a 30-acre property that's been vacant and contaminated for 30 years. On the right-hand side is the current Metropolitan Park. It's in two parts. The kids' campus is in the foreground, and the old festival lawn is in the farther away, but you can see the mature trees there. So it's actually got, pretty good bones for a park to be revitalized. It's been neglected for a long time, but there's a marina there you can see. And so these two pieces together form the basis for what we feel can help do that protection of what Dr. Beavers was talking about, with all of the benefits of a park system and the providing basically a natural buffer against sea level rise. And so the next slide, one more slide, and that is just, a potential view of that shipyard's property with lots of trees. Of course, everything's better at the riverfront. We've got breezes and cool. And to Gloria's point, the Hogan's Creek is right in the middle of this property. And so the access, and as you saw from the Emerald Trail, the Emerald Trail is going to provide a lot better access to the riverfront than we've ever had before.
All right. Well, yeah, that image does look beautiful. Are there examples from other cities that Jacksonville could look to, other communities that maybe face similar threats, and they've kind of incorporated this riverfront park kind of planning to protect themselves and seeing results?
Well, there's lots of plans in place right now, but any parks that have been designed in the last 5 years are really incorporating these resiliency measures. So what we see, for example, in the Smale Riverfront Park in Cincinnati, we like to use that example. It's a mid-sized city. It's a stadium district. It's a 32-acre park that has a number of features that have been designed specifically for flooding in mind. And the park did flood during the construction of the park. So for example, the electrical systems are all put up and above. The development, there's a development there, but it's up high on higher ground and set back away from the river and away from the road. And so there are many, many aspects. There's, native plants. There's other cities such as, in Chattanooga, there's a recent park called Renaissance Park. Chattanooga was one of the pioneers of riverfront, waterfront developments for park systems, and they have multiple parks along the river. But the most recent one, it was an old industrial site, and so they have this stormwater system where it actually cleans it actually filters the water as it goes down. It's called Renaissance Park, and so lots of good vegetation. And again, there are some developments, but they're set back away from the river.
Okay. I do remember going to Chattanooga many times as a kid, and it's just a very beautiful town. So Dr. Beavers, we've been talking about parks and green spaces and how they're kind of two options in this toolbox that we have to deal with climate change and its impacts. But as you well know, these assets are also threatened by the same impacts that they can help protect communities from. And I know a lot of your work has focused specifically on this issue as it relates to sea level rise. So here on the First Coast, we're fortunate to have a lot of great parks, and the National Park Service manages many of them. So can you walk us through how our national parks are threatened by climate change and sea level rise, and what the Park Service is doing to protect places like Cumberland Island, the Timucuan Preserve, and the Castillo de San Marcos down in St. Augustine?
Thank you very much for that question. The National Park Service takes adaptation to climate change very seriously, and we are very much involved in many of the resiliency efforts that you're seeing with the new administration. What we have done at Cumberland Island is look at areas such as some of the docks, because for a barrier island, how you access many of those places is going to be going by boat. And so we're looking at the elevation of the dock, the design of the dock. And so sea level is something we can plan for, but often in these locations, we're looking at storm surge and how it can withstand some of the major storm impacts that we will see along this coast. As we go up to the Castillo, very unique resource. It is something that we even take as a special jewel within the National Park Service because it's made out of coquina. So a lot of people who've seen forts around the national park system, they'll be made out of brick and masonry, or if you go out to Hawaii, you'll see some other types of built walls and structures. But with the Castillo, the coquina in and of itself may have some unique factors. If anyone is interested in a research project, look at some amazing research that was done by a high school student, looking at the coquina itself and how it may have withstood many of the impacts to the fort. And I'm actually really intrigued to see how that will actually help it weather climate change itself. We're also looking at the shoreline there and the structures that are used to protect it from particularly the ocean coming waves from the Atlantic. Now, if we also look at Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, there we've got Kingsley Plantation. And so you have a resource there that has wonderful forest and how we can maintain and protect some of the very, very iconic trees that are in there. When I was on site after Hurricane Matthew, we're looking at witness trees. We're looking at some very special resources. They're natural resources, but they have a huge cultural resource component. So with these areas, we're also looking at the protection that can be done for cultural resource sites, archaeological sites. So we've actually just undergone a big resilience planning effort. And this has involved many partners in the area, all the way from the Army Corps to other university partners, trying to look at some of the best strategies we can use to protect not only the shoreline, but provide for visitor use access and enjoyment, because that's also a very strong role for the National Park Service. So we look at a variety of strategies, but it's all in the interest of resilience and sustainability.
Okay, and I do want to stay on this topic for a minute, because it takes money to create, to preserve, and to repair these spaces, especially after hurricanes and floods. And I think it's safe to say that that cost of maintaining these spaces is only going to increase as sea levels rise and as the climate continues to change. So what's the plan for the future? And does there come a point when it's just too expensive to maintain these spaces?
That's a really important question, because we all know there is not unlimited funding for all of these amazing resources. Some that may be able to withstand sea level and change the way that we access the locations. The Park Service is undergoing a lot of work right now with the Great American Outdoors Act and the Legacy Restoration Fund. So we are looking at unique resources such as the Castillo, and are there opportunities we can take right now to make these resources more resilient to the impacts? Are there near-term repairs, modifications, or other changes that can be made not only to the use, but to the structure itself and the surrounding environment? So we have a really unique opportunity with this new Great American Outdoors Act to work with some of these resources and help steward them into the future.
Okay, Ms. McNair and Ms. Powell, I want to get your input on this as well, because as we've been talking about, parks and public spaces are such an asset to the communities that they're in, even beyond the role that they can play in protecting residents from the impacts of climate change. Research has shown that they can increase work productivity, they raise property values, they reduce energy use, and they can even help reduce crime. So, Ms. McNair, what steps are being taken to protect the projects that Groundwork Jacksonville is working on from the future impacts of climate change?
Well, I'd like to say that resiliency is a major consideration in all of our projects. Everything that we're doing around trail design and creek restoration includes green infrastructure improvements to increase resiliency and protect the residents in some of Jacksonville's most economically and environmentally vulnerable neighborhoods. And the question that folks often ask us is like, okay, you're planning this marvelous trail, this 30 miles of trail. How are you going to maintain it all? Well, it's something that my CEO, Kay Haas, thought of from the very beginning, and she's talked about it for the past 3 years that I've known her, that we train and develop our own Emerald Trail stewards to help maintain that green structure that we've just built and designed and put in place. Who's going to maintain it and make sure it stays, make sure that we keep the invasive plants out? Our environmental stewards will play a big role in that. Paid people from the community, paid to help maintain this new environment, this new wonderful green space that they have.
Okay, Ms. Powell, how do the Riverfront Parks that you're calling for fit into this conversation? Do you think there could come a point when it would be too expensive or too difficult to maintain parks along the St. Johns River? Or are there ways that we could design these parks to make them more resilient to the future flooding and sea level rise that we're talking about?
Yeah, it is a great question, but either way, whether you do gray infrastructure or green infrastructure, we have to plan for sea level rise, and it is going to be expensive. There are funding mechanisms out there. For example, in New York, after Hurricane Sandy, the HUD gave major grants for Resilient by Design competition. And just this week, the East River Coastal Resilience Project is breaking ground on a major project that has been designed from the start for resiliency in mind, as well as, of course, being parks. So you design it, with wetlands and bioswales and rain gardens and living shorelines where you can. You can't do living shorelines everywhere. But all of these things, I mean, what we have the opportunity here between the Emerald Trail and the Riverfront Parks is to start from scratch and to use all of these latest methods that I'm sure Dr. Beavers probably knows better than we do as to designing those things into the project. And so, gray infrastructure, seawalls and pump systems, and, those are hugely expensive. So, in many cases, it should be less expensive to use natural green infrastructure, that will work with nature and not against it.
Okay, and Dr. Beaver, so we already kind of discussed how trees and parks can trap and store carbon, but removing air pollution also has public health benefits. And as we discussed in an ADAPT event last year, climate change exacerbates a lot of health issues like respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses. And I don't think this is as obvious as some of the other benefits of parks. So could you walk us through some of these health benefits and how parks can help mitigate the public health impacts of climate change?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to point to my colleague, Daniel Butke, who really helped me with this. We actually have officers within the National Park Service who serve with our health service. And with those benefits, we actually help design some of the elements of parks because we know the World Health Organization has named climate change the greatest human health threat of the century. And with that, we know that ambient air pollution, primarily from fossil fuel consumption and combustion, is the 5th leading cause of premature death globally. That's a pretty stark statistic. But we also know impacts we're seeing around the world are increased pollen, the direct impacts of severe storms. We have been talking about storms in this discussion today, but we also know increased temperatures. I'm living out west, and the impacts from wildfires is staggering on air quality. We've seen people relocating from California, even Colorado, where I live. We have been dealing with those impacts. So we know that the air quality and other impacts are really clear. One of the elements we are seeing and benefits of parks is for mental health. The ability to get out in nature, the ability to visit with a tree, to see grass, and to really be in spaces that take us away from these great, wonderful technology laced screens that are helping us connect tonight. But we also need to get out into nature and breathe some fresh air, but also the ability to connect with some of these spaces. The Park Service manages iconic resources, amazing historic, natural, cultural resources. But we also know it doesn't take a prescription from a physician to recommend you go to a park. We have seen that happen as well. We have, projects that encourage every kid to go to a park if they're in 4th or 5th grade, because we're trying to start them early. We know that's a good, healthy habit to begin, but we also know the role in parks is an amazing, important part of our human health and as part of a society, but as individuals as well.
Yeah, no, I've definitely personally experienced those mental health benefits over the pandemic. I live in a very heavily wooded area, and just being able to just go outside and be in nature when I can't really go out and do anything with people has been very beneficial for my personal mental health. So Ms. McNair, a fellow Brendan Shane, who's the climate program director of the Trust for Public Land, he says in addition to the physical resilience that parks provide, protecting from flooding and sea level rise, they can also provide what he calls a kind of social resilience. So as he puts it, the stronger the bonds are between neighbors, the better able they are to react to a shock like a flood or a heat wave. So I'm just curious to know, do you agree with that? And if you do, have you seen or have you heard of any evidence to support that theory here in Jacksonville?
Well, I do agree that it better prepares a community to respond to emergencies or to that severe climate change that we see with our hurricanes that come through. I have not witnessed the camaraderie that develops from a storm system, but I can say that I've witnessed firsthand how being outdoors and enjoying the environment brings people together. And that's just based on the community engagement that I've done with neighborhoods along the Emerald Trail, and especially in the McCoys Creek area, North Riverside and Brooklyn communities. We formed a group based on feedback from the residents called Community Restoration Environmental Stewardship Training Program, CREST, if you ever hear that acronym, CREST. And it involves adults and teens, and it was designed as for something that the residents wanted. They were interested in becoming better leaders and mentoring the youth. And so we formed a group with youth and adults, and the relationships that formed from that were wonderful. Watching youth go out on a bird walk, it's something that they had never done before and that they actually enjoyed, and watch them make friends. And we had a creek festival introducing folks to the creek design at McCoys Creek. And, you know, I made the assumption that because people live close together within a couple of miles that they knew each other or they stayed in touch. But I saw people who had not seen each other for years actually bond and catch up. And those are just links that are just so important. When you know your neighbor, you will go and help your neighbor in need, even when that neighbor is in another connecting community. When that neighbor is in Newtown or when that neighbor is in Brooklyn, you will help them and help them get through whatever hardship is in the works. And so this is something that we've done a deep dive with our community engagement, and we've gotten to know the needs of our community, what their desires are, and we're even working on equitable development within North Riverside, so that they can increase these bonds and have some of the things that they wish to have, improvements in their neighborhoods.
Okay. Ms. Powell, so this is an argument similar to what I've heard from the Army Corps when they talk about the dredging of the St. Johns River. If the riverfront lots that you're talking about were developed, yes, it would have a detrimental effect on the environment, and it would make the city more vulnerable to flooding in ways. But there are steps that can be taken to mitigate those impacts, and that development would create jobs and generate revenue, and money is critical for any city that wants to become more resilient. So what's your take on that argument, and do you think that there is any way that our riverfront could be developed in a way that provides community benefits on par with what parks and green spaces would create?
Well, we already have development on our riverfront downtown. So the South Bank is pretty much fully developed, as well as Brooklyn and you know, about half of the North Bank. But I want to emphasize that parks create positive economic impact to the community. And they do that because they are places where any development can claim the riverfront as an amenity to their buildings. If, for example, in St. Petersburg, which has a wonderful preserved riverfront, waterfront, it's actually the bay, they have 6 waterfront districts, and the development is 4, 5, and 6 blocks inland, because each of those developments can claim the waterfront as their amenity. And those developments are not getting incentives like we are giving to developers to come to our downtown. So a great public space, you just think of some of the great ones that you probably have been to. So Grant Park in Chicago or Central Park in New York. All you have to do is look around and see that that is valuable real estate that is around a great public space. And so, you know, we see that that is a real opportunity. As well as, you know, parks do create jobs also. You know, there will be jobs during construction and maintenance and amenities within the parks. We know that, for example, Mosh has plans to go to the North Bank, and back to what Gloria was talking about, you know, the chance for education and outdoor culture and events, you know, that all brings in revenue.
Okay, and Dr. Beavers, on sort of the flip side of that argument about St. Augustine that we were talking about earlier, parks and historical cultural resources in St. Augustine are the primary driver of the local economy. And I know we kind of discussed this earlier, but it's a very fascinating topic to me. So these resources, not only forts, but archaeological sites above and below ground level, how do we preserve them for future generations to enjoy and to help protect the local economy?
Great question. The economy is actually, it's one measure of value. We also, as the National Park Service, strive to protect places and resources that are also of scientific, educational, recreational, cultural, and spiritual value. We could also go so far to say there are efforts to protect wilderness. We're going a little bit further south. Let's go down to Everglades in Florida, okay? And these actually can protect endangered wildlife. Those are also mired in an intrinsic value. So I think we're actually having a discussion here of what we value in our local community, but also many people value these resources by simply knowing they exist. One of the values we see for the National Park Service is that many people derive value just by knowing Grand Canyon or Everglades exist. It's very important for many people to see that side. Long-term preservation in the face of climate change will use a suite of wildly different management tools. We are gonna have to try some radical things in some of these places. And our partners and communities will have to be part of that process as we carefully consider the merits of each management option across the values that are at stake. I mean, we are talking nation to nation conversations as we look at many of are associated and affiliated tribes for these locations as well. And where we have some of these important archaeological sites that we're aware of, we're doing our best to stabilize those and document those resources, particularly ones that are experiencing erosion and the information they contain prior to loss. Because we know we cannot, not everything is going to be able to receive the same level of treatment. That's often what we describe within cultural resources, how you treat the resource. And so that is a very important and very poignant conversation that will require many partners and all stakeholders around a common table.
Okay. Ms. McNair, minority and low-income communities are frequently the communities that are hit first and hit hardest by the impacts of climate change. And you mentioned earlier that the creek projects that Groundwork Jacksonville is working on are in predominantly African-American areas. So is this issue something that the city of Jacksonville is taking into account with other projects? And as you said, it is an issue at play with the creeks, but is it also something that is being considered with the development of the Emerald Trail project?
Yes, I will say that we will, in all of our projects as we move forward, we will always look at the equitable development of that community. And it's true, 72% of the neighborhoods we are working with are considered low to very low income, with 30% of those households making less than $18,000 a year. And there's been that added effect from all of this. Dr. Beavers has already talked about the chronic diseases that can be associated in certain neighborhoods. And we definitely see it in some of our urban communities, the incidence of diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, obesity. And so we know that trails can help with alleviate some of these concerns just by getting people active and getting people outdoors. Instead of children sitting at the TV and playing video games, they go out and they walk and they ride their bikes on the trail. And currently in some of our neighborhoods where we're working, and we're going to see this throughout in different communities, there are no amenities there for the children. There are no walking paths for the adults. We may say, oh, go out, exercise, ride a bike, take a walk, but where are the sidewalks? The sidewalks are broken. And we see this often, so it will always inform the work that we do. We learned it first in North Riverside when I was going out and doing community engagement with the residents. And I was talking about the flood mitigation and how it would improve the habitat, and introducing native vegetation, getting the birds back, the wildlife back. And they were like, after they knew me for a while, they were like, yes, Ms. McNair, yes, Gloria, or Ms. Mack. They have different names for me. And they were like, all of that is fine. We want the flooding to be taken care of, but we need jobs. And we need to feel safe in our neighborhoods. We need home repairs. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at as well. And we're have the city involved in looking at these aspects of the restoration projects. Because, and I'm going to say something that people don't talk about often, but in some cases with restoration, with improved habitat comes gentrification and displacement. And one of our goals is that anyone who wants to remain in their neighborhood after the restoration project, after the trails, that we want them to be able to stay there and to be productive and to find employment. Preferably, it would be like find entrepreneurship opportunities along the trail. And I'm getting kind of preachy, but I'm really passionate about keeping people in their homes, in their community, and being able to enjoy the improvements there.
Ms. Powell, I'd love to ask you a follow-up question on that. The cities that you've looked at where they're developing these extensive park systems, how are they dealing with that issue to prevent gentrification?
Well, the key concept is that we've developed is a riverfront for all. And, you know, what we've seen, and I talked with the designer of the Columbus, Ohio, Scioto Mile park system, and he said that what he's experienced is that it's been the most democratic space that he's ever designed, and democratic with a lowercase d, meaning that people from all walks of life are able to come together and enjoy this riverfront access. And we know in Jacksonville that the St. Johns River is our biggest asset. We've been hearing that now for so many years, but we just haven't been able to, you know, deliver on that promise. So, you know, we know in Jacksonville, the riverfront lands right now, we have about 1,100 miles of shoreline, and 90% of it is privately owned. So there is not that much access left, and the access we do have is downtown. So we feel like that's really the opportunity to dive into what Gloria's been talking about, and you know, not cut off people from the riverfront, but give them more access. And so, you know, it does, you know, I'm trying to think of, you know, if you've ever walked through Central Park in New York, you know, it is a place, it's great people watching because there's so many different kinds of people there. And that's what we see urban parks are able to do, you know, maybe more so than some of the other parks. We've got these, you know, because it usually attracts people into events and places. We see a opportunity for a 365-day-a-year park, not just a park that, you know, has to have an event for people to come together. It can have events, and those are really helpful. You know, boaters need a place to go also, and, you know, kayakers, and, you know, this is where the creek system is going to be so, you know, complementary because, you know, and you could rent a bike, and with e-bikes and scooters, you know, the Emerald Trail is going to be a lot quicker to get to the riverfront in a lot of neighborhoods. And it will also allow people to rent a bike if they're at their neighborhoods and go along the trail and see parts of Jacksonville that they may never have seen. So, so yeah, we see it as a social equity move as well as an economic and a resiliency move.
Okay, and Dr. Beavers, we've talked a lot about the benefits of parks tonight. Mm-hmm. Nationwide, when we're talking about National Park Service parks, are the benefits they're providing being felt in minority and low-income communities?
Historically, those benefits may not have been as equally distributed. For some of our parks, the gateway communities may receive disproportionate types of benefits. It may depend on the time of year. It may depend on the type of access. COVID has certainly introduced a lot of changes that many of us could not have anticipated 18 months ago. And with that, we also see that climate change, racism, and inequality have also been declared a public health crisis. So we can use the power of parks for health and universal interest in health to help advance equity through some programs. The Park Service has programs such as Your Park, Your Health, your Smokies Hikes for Healing. They focus on increasing understanding of the detrimental impacts of racism. We have a Park Health Ambassadors program and diversity and inclusion programs for our workforce. While these impacts are disproportionately impacting underserved communities, these communities are not only more likely to live and work in communities and industries more directly impacted, but also lack access to some of the mitigation and adaptation resources. I've heard mentioned some of the green infrastructure, not just the hard-built gray infrastructure. Some of these nature-based features may be some of the best opportunities for some more disadvantaged communities. They're not often quite as expensive. And so for communities that lack resources and access for other adaptation, strategies such as air conditioning, flood mitigation, air purifying, mental health care, some of these more green nature-based features can be very useful in those areas. But we also just have to be very honest that some disadvantaged communities have historically lacked access to green space, as well as some of the investment in the public lands. And they also at times host a disproportionate level of impact from some of the activities we have seen that are contributing to climate change. And the National Park Service is very much looking at that, how the parks have been addressed. We have parks that have been called the crown jewels, whether it's a Grand Canyon, a Yellowstone, and we have to look at even the parks that the National Park Service manages. And are we giving equal time to parks such as Martin Luther King, Stonewall, or other areas that document some of the very challenging history that our country has gone through?
And I would like to just add, here in Jacksonville, the Timucuan Preserve is just a gem of a park. And sometimes people say, well, Jacksonville has so many, acres of parks. We have one of the largest park systems. But if you look at a map, they're usually on the outskirts of our county. And the Timucuan Preserve Jacksonville does not have a great public transportation system. So that hinders the ability for people to get to a great place that we have, right? That is just so amazing, but it's just hard to get to. And that's where I think you need both, but a downtown park and with the Emerald Trail system, parks and trails, that's one of the things we see in all these other cities is that the park systems and the trail systems are really hand in glove and allow that kind of access.
Yeah, and Nancy, I would definitely agree with you on that. Getting to a park can be challenging and oftentimes even access within a park. So we look at some of the areas that some of our disadvantaged or differently mobile populations have once they get into a park. Oftentimes there'll be a small section of paved trail, but let's also talk about braille signs for interactive experiences or other challenges for some of the auditory experiences that we have with parks. We have a program for natural sounds and night skies, and how can people relate to these different sensory experiences in parks is something we also have to look at how to facilitate that access. We've seen a lot of opportunities come forward with the online access. So for some people who may not be able to visit, they may have to participate in some of our benefits from our parks in different ways. The 3D visualization is amazing. You can go down into a cave system, even if you're a little bit claustrophobic, and see some of those amazing resources as well. So I do think that is a way we can look at additional benefits from having these parks and green spaces.
All right. Well, I want to get to some audience questions now. Looks like we've got several people who are typing out their questions in that chat box. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for our panelists, be sure you type it out in the chat box and mark that bubble to the right so that we know it's a question. So we will start out with this question from Corey. Corey asks, how are the parks going to be an economic stimulus? I'm assuming this question is probably directed at you, Ms. Powell.
Well, what we've seen and studies have shown that parks return and from 6-to-1 to 40-to-1 return on investment. This is we've got a document on our website that shows from, for example, studies from Pittsburgh where this has happened, and it's because it attracts surrounding businesses. If business and want to be around great public spaces. Now we're talking, world-class, great public spaces like the Emerald Trail is doing, and like what we envision on our waterfront, like what St. Petersburg has done, or Smale, or any number of other riverfront parks. They have to be done really well so that people want to come there. So business follows people. And if you bring people in, and again, it's not like we need to do that or invest in other things in our downtown. We all know here in Jacksonville that our downtown lacks in a lot of areas. So this is an important piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece that we have, but that's where we know that other cities don't have to pay out as much as we do for attracting businesses here. It will come if you invest in ourselves. And Jacksonville just hasn't been very good at investing in ourselves. So that's one reason why, boaters talk to us and they say, we're dying to go downtown. We want something to do, and to have free things to do. And that gets back to that social equity component. It's free things to do, but once you're down there, people are going to frequent restaurants. They want to get ice cream cones. They want to walk around and attend a museum. So that ancillary things, and also people want to live and work around great spaces. So that's where the impact comes.
Okay, and this next question is from Jyoti. And I'm going to pose this to you, Ms. McNair. He asked about trails going through community gardens, and if parks and these green spaces have things like fruit trees that can help feed homeless people, is what he says specifically, but also just members of that community, I think, are those factors that are being considered with the projects Groundwork Jacksonville is undertaking?
They are indeed factors that are being considered in all of our projects. The topic specifically came up when we were looking at the La Villa Link. Someone had this historical perspective that there used to be orange groves along that area. And so maybe that can be incorporated into the landscaping and into some of the native plantings. And also, I'll talk about North Riverside, whom I know I talk about them a lot. I've spent a lot of time with them. When we did our equitable development with them, that was one of the important things that came out of that discussion, having a community garden, because unfortunately the area is also in a food desert. So it's a very practical thing to consider. So Groundwork has helped them get to reestablish land that they had there dedicated for a garden, and we have helped them get the seeds and the plants and the working with the extension office to get some of those supplies there, and we're there working with the community side by side with our group I mentioned, Crest, earlier, and the residents. People, it is so cool to see people walk by and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing over there?" Well, I think I'll come over and help. And they help with the weeding and they help with the planting. And I think we would love to see more of that in a very practical sense, for it to provide food for people who are needy, but it also affects that mental health, being outdoors and putting your hands in the dirt and watching things grow. And also we've even talked about doing yoga, meditation at the park, and that also helps with the mental health aspect. So thank you for that question. You gave me an opportunity to gush about our garden.
Well, let me stay with you for this next one as well, Ms. McNair. This question is from Olin. And Olin says, it appears both Hogan and McCoys Creek go underground before entering St. Johns River. Is opening these up part of Groundwork Jacksonville's plan?
Yes, it is. And that process is called daylighting. And it's so great that someone knows this. A lot of people are so unaware of those creeks. They may be walking right beside it and they're like, "Oh, that's a creek over there." So it's great that the question came from someone who's very aware. One of the Hogan's Creek, especially there at the Shands or the UF Health campus, they are eager to daylight that area and let people enjoy Hogan's Creek, because like I said, people are parking there and walking around and never realize the creek is right underneath. So daylighting.
Okay, and then we have a question from William. William asks, how do most cities pay for large park infrastructure projects? Dr. Beavers, why don't you take this one?
The funding for some of these park projects can be very interesting and diverse. I'll give you an example, and this is one. Let's go to the West Coast. Let's go out to the Pacific in San Francisco. Oftentimes we can have large partnership efforts that may come into an area. There's one called Crissy Field within Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So that particular effort was a large fundraising effort to restore some wetlands, and it has become a tremendous benefit to the local community. If you hear people, or you see a lot of movies, you look at dog walking in San Francisco and you see the Golden Gate Bridge, you're in pretty much that unit of the National Park Service. But that was also done with a lot of partnership effort. So it does require some fundraising. It can, at times, some parks in some areas can be mitigation. If you're restoring wetlands, that may be for mitigating damage that may have done to lands in another area. So we are actually seeing the benefits and the ability to do some wetland mitigation banking and other elements. So there can be a diversity of ways to fund these types of developments.
Okay, and Ms. Powell, I'll pose this one to you. This one comes from Corey. Corey asks, are these parks and trails going to increase crime? And I know I personally have seen research that shows that parks and green space can actually decrease crime. What have you seen in these other cities that you've looked at where they are expanding their parks and green spaces?
Well, parks that have a lot of people in them that attract people, that are designed well, you have like what Jane Jacobs says about eyes on the street. So people create safety when you're in numbers so I have not seen that crime statistics are higher at all. In fact, because I think that's really where you have regular people coming down all the time, 365 days a year, and looking after each other. If you design a park for mothers with small children, then you will be designing a great space where everybody feels comfortable to come. And so, I don't see that. I don't see that. I don't know if Gloria has any research on that.
No, you probably saw me nod, and I was like, I agree with you, Nancy. I haven't seen any literature that says that it increases crime. Quite the opposite occurs, and it's due to good lighting. There's paths that are well lit, and it's like Nancy said, when people are there and the design is well done, it's going to discourage crime. Most criminals like to operate in the dark. That's where the drug deals are going down, and they don't want to do it in a well lit park where there are lots of people going through and enjoying it. So I don't think that is a problem.
Dr. Beavers, do you know anything about this? Have you seen any research that might indicate that parks and green space can have an impact on crime?
For some of the urban areas, I think there are some considerations. It may depend if, for some of our National Park Service areas, if you're in an urban area such as Washington, D.C. or San Francisco, we have our park police. So you actually may be instituting some patrols in some of these areas. We also have more urban parks such as Gateway National Recreation Area up in New York and New Jersey. Some of these areas are increasing the visibility and actually are producing some managed areas that have a bit more attention paid to them as if they were not being managed as parks, and maybe areas that, to use a land use management, laid fallow, are not as managed in other condition other than, say, a ruin. So I think it is important to recognize that it's an area that you are paying attention to, and I think that can be a deterrent to crime.
And I would just add, what we've seen in a lot of cities is that there is a conservancy model or some kind of a nonprofit organization that is formed, especially for certain parks. Like in Jacksonville, we have the Memorial Park Association, and they work, and Emerald Trail is, Groundwork is doing this very well with the city, but they work in concert with the city in order to, really observe and be there, plan events, maintain it, notice when things are off. And so, in Jacksonville, we've got the Downtown Vision folks that have ambassadors down there. And so, that seems to be working, but we would envision some kind of conservancy model that we've seen in, the Charles River Esplanade has both an association and a conservancy. Louisville Parks have a Parks Foundation. Any number of these things do. And so, that can also help.
Okay, and James asks, continued port dredging will make the city more vulnerable to storms and sea level rise. Can some of the money that the city might be seeing as a result of this dredging be used to mitigate those impacts and possibly fund some of these projects that we've been talking about this evening? Ms. Powell?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the Army Corps of Engineers and the dredging. I know that they were trying to have funding to mitigate, and I'm not sure that has gone through. What we've seen is that, most parks are funded from a variety of sources. So grants are usually a part of the picture, sometimes up to 30% of a park design. Smale Riverfront Park had about 30% in grants. So did the Columbus Riverfront. Chicago's Riverwalk started with a transportation grant, and the East River Park in New York is a grant from HUD. So it's not going to fund the entire thing, but between grants and private philanthropy, private or corporate philanthropy, and city funding, so many cities have figured this out. So we think that we can figure it out.
And I know several of the Jacksonville City Council members, before they signed off on supporting the continued dredging, they said their support was contingent on the fact that mitigation was undertaken in the future. And I know if you look at the City Council Special Committee on Resiliency's report, which was released recently, they outline basically investing in green infrastructure and green spaces as possible solutions the city could pursue. So I think it's definitely a possibility that the city potentially uses the funds. I mean, it might not directly be earmarked as funds that the city has made as a result of the dredging, but they will almost certainly be investing in green infrastructure and green space in the future.
Yeah, and I would just add, that they also have a section in there about insurance. And so far, insurance continues to insure buildings right up until the river. And as soon as that changes, which it will change, the insurance rates will rise. Some insurance, will not cover certain things. That's going to change the whole picture of riverfront or waterfront development. And, in most cities, they're looking at retreat from the riverfront. And so what better thing to do is to have a buffer of green infrastructure between that, move the development to higher ground inland, and then allow the riverfront to be more resilient and a community space. I think that's what we see as such a great idea, concept. Is it's both multiple benefits.
Yeah, and we are seeing the city already do that with at least residential areas in the South Shores neighborhood and Kennedy Drive. The city is actively buying homes from residents to demolish the homes and then to leave those areas as green space in perpetuity. So yeah, definitely something the city is looking at. Okay, let's look for another question here. Let's see, Mary says, these are great initiatives. I am interested to know how to transform the culverts as greenways for native plants. This is an opportunity for improving climate change. Is there a forum where I can get involved? Ms. McNair, why don't you take this one first?
A forum for involvement. We always welcome volunteers to be involved with Groundwork Jacksonville, www.groundworkjacksonville.org, and have a voice. Come out to our events and be a part of what we're doing. The Green Team, which is a youth environmental stewardship program, they're always doing projects on the S line where they're working on the bioswale. They're working on pollinator gardens, and be a part of that and join our team and have input and inform us on ideas that you have. We're always open to input.
Ms. Powell, do you want to pick this one up too in terms of getting involved?
Yeah, and just back to the native plant idea, the Florida Native Plant Society is one of our coalition members, and we would certainly envision native plants and trees as a part of any kind of green infrastructure and park system. As far as getting involved, we are an advocacy organization, and you can sign up for our newsletter or visit us on any of the social media. It's riverfrontparksnow.org. But I do want to say one thing, which is that there's a upcoming initiative that is going to be kicked off in the next couple of weeks in concert with the DuPont Fund, who is kicking off a riverfront activation study, which will be asking for input from the community. In fact, groundwork is going to be helping the community engagement process. And that's one of the things that we have really wanted to emphasize, which is whatever riverfront we have should be really informed by what the community wants. What kind of riverfront do we want? And so there will be these opportunities. We have committed to help publicize those. So, give your input in these opportunities that will be happening in the next 4 to 6 weeks, so that the DuPont Fund, when they are, engaging they're doing a pretty extensive community engagement process and engaging firms, design firms. This is a really exciting development. It's going to be about a 6-month process. And so, the holistic view of what this riverfront should be is including the 2 creeks and what's going to happen there through the Emerald Trail is really an exciting opportunity.
Okay, Ms. Powell, I've got another question that I think kind of ties into what you were just saying about community involvement. So Brett asks, does the community really, and he emphasizes the word really, does the community really have a voice in policy when it comes to city-owned land use?
Well, I would say our city hasn't been the last few years, we haven't had as many opportunities, and I know there's some frustration out there. I do know that the DuPont Fund is very committed to not just community engagement, but kind of an equitable and diverse set of voices. And so they are, I don't know, Gloria can tell you a little bit more about how they're designing their engagement, but I do know that that is their value, and belonging is a big part of their values. And so we expect that will happen in a really good way.
Okay, and Ms. McNair, this is just a question of my own because I know this is a focus of your work. Why do you think it's important to get communities involved when we're talking about creating these spaces?
Whenever I talk about this, I like to go back and talk about my work in public health, and you would have experts, people with several initials, degrees behind their name, who would make decisions about what was best for a community. And they'd go full bore, and institute this change and then 2-3 years later, they wonder why it didn't work, why it all fell apart. It's because they did not talk to the people whom those changes affected. You have to go into the community and you have to get feedback from those people who are being affected by this, even when we say it's a restoration, but is it something that they really want? If you're talking about amenities, what amenities are going to work for them? What amenities do they need? If you're thinking about job opportunities, you talk to these folks, what type of jobs are available, and you help them. You look at training opportunities for jobs that will develop because of the restoration. I cannot overstate how important it is to talk to the people who live there. And like Nancy was saying, we will be involved in the community engagement around riverfront activation. And we're making a very purposeful effort to engage all people. We will have activities at the riverfront, but we will also have some community activities to reach those people who may feel as if they're left out, as if they're not part of the development of this city. We want to hear their voices, and we want to know what they want. So it's going to be very intense. And and Nancy and I will probably be working a little bit together. I love it. So we're excited, but you have to get input from the people in order to do what's right for the city and for the citizens and for it to be inclusive.
Okay, we have a Nina. She asks, is there any possibility of partnering with mental health service providers at a time when we're becoming aware of the advantages of immersion in the natural world? There might be funding opportunities for well-designed parks that serve as destinations for social service/mental health groups. Dr. Beavers, you want to take the first shot at this one?
Yes, that's a great point. In terms of what we're seeing for mental health, that the benefits of being out in nature for many people who have become so disconnected, it really can have transformative experiences for people. For some people, we talk about the amount of healing that can actually occur. People may have heard of like Outward Bounds projects, other things where you do these day to week long backcountry experiences. But we can also find that just a few hours in an open space can be very healing for certain people. We've seen a lot of programs that work with some of our differently abled populations and the ability to provide access. In one of our local communities, I'll give you an example from a state park, but we have a mobility, it's basically a four-wheel drive wheelchair you can reserve and get out and get into spaces. So while we talk about the benefits of being in these areas, we have to look at how we provide not only the access, we talked about the actual transportation needed to get to some of these areas, but also the programs and opportunities once you are there. But I do think there are tremendous opportunities to look at the mental health benefits of our green spaces and parks.
Okay, and Katie asked, can these efforts in Jacksonville be funded in part by the state level focus and investment on resiliency planning for coastal regions? In terms of action residents can take in advocating for allocation of funding, is that directed towards City Council? Ms. Powell, I'll have you take this one.
Yeah, well, we haven't gotten to that point yet. So, people have asked us about the funding, and until you know where the boundaries are and how big your park is and what kind of amenities you're going to have, we're not at that point yet of raising funds. We do know, as Dr. Beaver said, the American Outdoors Act has funding. There is resiliency funding. There is transportation funding. For example, the Riverwalk. Tampa just got a build grant to build out 22 miles of their Riverwalk, which is also going to be like an Emerald Trail because it goes for 22 miles. So we do know that, and I know, Groundwork has had a number of grants that have helped get them going to where they are today. So the answer is yes, it would be local, state, federal, as multiple sources of funding, but we're not at that point yet, and we hope to be there soon.
Okay, well, I think that was pretty much all the questions that we had. But before we wrap things up this evening, I did want to give each of our panelists a chance for some closing thoughts. And Dr. Beavers, I think the others already shared ways they can get involved, but I definitely want to hear that from you as well. If the audience members are passionate about this issue, is basically just where they can go to get involved. So Dr. Beavers, let's start with you. Closing thoughts?
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this today. I'm very pleased to participate with these panelists that are so well informed and so engaged with the local communities. For people who want to be involved more with national park units that are in the local area, or even for some of your vacations, I'll mention some opportunities because we have a lot of volunteers in parks. And some people who actually, when they retire, will come on and work as an interpreter or other portions, of park staff. If you're great in maintenance, guess what? Parks need maintenance too. But I would also say, look at some of those volunteer opportunities. Sometimes it's a campground host. Sometimes it is actually someone who will come in and do an interpretive program. It may also be sometimes they're actually work days. We've seen various beach cleanup efforts or other ones. Look at some of your local opportunities for those ways to engage, but also take your expertise. Work with your local communities, work with your parks, and whereas it may not be a unit of the National Park System, but find your local area, and oftentimes they will want some additional benefit for the stewardship that all of these great parks and open spaces need.
Okay, Ms. McNair, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, when we talk about resiliency, I want us to remember that we need to think about our youth. when we plan for that. We must educate our youth about climate change, that it's real, and how they can help mitigate that. They are our future. They're going to be the leaders. And if they can start now and pursue careers in science, in engineering, they can be the change that we're going to need. And so always develop our youth, look for opportunities. Once again, I direct you to Groundworks website. There are applications there for the Green Team, for the stewardship program this summer, and just invest in our youth. I can't say more. Take your kid out for a walk and talk about nature. Identify some birds and some leaves.
Okay, and Ms. Powell, anything you want to add before we end tonight?
Yeah, I just would say, echoing Gloria's talk about the youth, we have a young professionals group that has just gotten energized and is hosting a Zoom presentation next Wednesday at 4:00, Wind Down Wednesday. And they would like to plan some in-person events afterwards. So any, young professionals, we feel like that kind of advocacy, not that City Council doesn't listen to us, but they are the future. They have young children. They want to enjoy these spaces. And so learning how to advocate. I know when I was 25 or 30, I did not know anything about a City Council or how to engage in the process. So that would be one thing. Again, if you follow us and Groundworks, you're going to hear about engagement opportunities. So when you see something like take a survey or come to the riverfront and give us your ideas, please do so, because that is the input, the output is as good as what the input is going to be. For example, even just going down to the riverfront, this Thursday, the Thursdays in April, the city of Jacksonville has been doing concerts from 5 to 8 and at the former place of the Jacksonville Landing. And it's a fabulous time to go down and just experience the river and the outdoors and the people and enjoy it. And then imagine, what would you like to see here? And give us your ideas. So that would be my, and also there's, things like writing letters to the editor, writing your city council. Those things will happen. There's nothing on the, legislative agenda yet, but they need to hear from their constituents as to, building. And that's what we've been trying to work on, is building that community support.
Look, I'd like to say thank you, Nancy, for mentioning jams. I will be there this Thursday and next Thursday to talk to people about what they would like to see at Hogan's Creek, at the riverfront. So thank you for plugging that as well.
Yeah, so be sure to be there to catch Ms. McNair and give her your thoughts on the projects. So I did have one thing I wanted to add as well before we close tonight. I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that the whole ADAPT team and some of our national and international partners will be presenting as part of Florida Climate Week, which is happening right now, actually. And our talk will focus on the importance of local climate journalism and how small newsrooms can expand their reach and their impact. We're scheduled to present at 9 a.m. on Thursday, which happens to be Earth Day. And we won't be the only local group presenting during Florida Climate Week. Resilient Jacks, a local advocacy organization that was heavily involved with the Jacksonville City Council Special Committee on Resiliency, we will be presenting at 11 a.m. on Thursday. And Ms. Powell, I believe you are one of the speakers.
I am.
Does that mean we can expect Parks to be a part of Thursday's presentation?
You can bet on it. It was recorded though, so
yeah, ours was as well.
Yeah, okay. It's on Parks and Resiliency. Yep.
All right. So for details on our presentation and others, including Resilient Jacks, you can go to floridaclimateweek.org. Okay, so panelists, thank you again so much for being here with us tonight. A big thank you to our audience as well. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email with a post-event survey that should be hitting your inbox shortly. And if you want to know about future events like this or read stories about climate change in Northeast Florida, subscribe to the ADAPT newsletter at adaptflorida.org. Financial support for ADAPT comes from WJCT readers and listeners, with additional support from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and the 2040 Foundation. Thank you to everyone involved in tonight's event, and thanks to our audience again. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.